as an introduction to the Chumash Vayikra, which speaks about the laws of karbonos, sacrifices, and when is a Kohen permitted to officiate, when he's not permitted to officiate, who's qualified to be the Kohen. The inauguration of the Mishkan, when Aaron and his children were installed as Kohanim, the very important Ramban, the Ramban, in his introduction to Sefer Shmos, Shmos is referred to as Sefer HaGeula, the book of redemption, redeemed from Egypt, which is obvious, and the objective of the redemption was Kabbalah Torah at Sinai, to become God's chosen people. But what relevance does the Mishkan, the building of the Mishkan, have to do with Sefer HaGeula? Why is that part of the redemption? So he explains that the Avos HaKadoshim, what was their dimension and their capacity in regard to a relationship with Hashem? They themselves were the location where the Shekhinah dwelt. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, dwelt with them. The ultimate objective was to be restored to that level. That is full redemption. Until we're restored to where they were at, we're not fully redeemed. It was only with the building of the Mishkan that the Shekhinah re-entered into the midst of the Jewish people through its medium, through the Mishkan being the medium, that was considered being fully redeemed, fully reinstated. That's the Ramban. Therefore, the Parshios, the portions of the Mishkan have relevance to redemption for that reason. Because it's only through the Mishkan do we return to the level of the Avos HaKadoshim, where Hashem dwells in our midst. Now we're starting Parshas Vayikra. Hashem calls to Moshe. As we'll see in a moment, we speak now about the species of sacrifices that qualify to be sacrifices, the different types of sacrifices. This is the book of Vayikra. Vayikra, which is known as Torah's Kohanim. The Torah which pertains to the Kohanim, as I mentioned, the Kohanim, how they officiate, with what they officiate, what qualifies them, in what context do they officiate. That's the portion, that is the Sefer Vayikra. We speak about Moshe Rabbeinu being Shokol Keneged Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu, as an individual, he was the equivalent of the whole Klal Yisrael. It's alluded to a number of locations where it says, to Moshe and to Klal Yisrael. From here, the Torah reveals that Moshe was Shokol Keneged Yisrael. He was the equivalent of Klal Yisrael. The Avos HaKadoshim, they themselves were Shokol Keneged Klal Yisrael, because we see they themselves only as individuals. This is pre-Klal Yisrael. They were qualified to what? That the Shekhinah should be in their midst. They were the Merkava. They were the location of the Shekhinah. They were the equivalent of the Holy of Holies. Vayikra el Moshe. Hashem called to Moshe, and it's obvious the Aleph of Vayikra is a small Aleph. And that's why it's written in the Sefer Torah as a small Aleph. Vaydaber Shem Elov me'ol moed lemor. And he spoke to him from the Ol Moed, saying, let's see the first Rashi. Vayikra el Moshe, chol dibros, chol amiros, chol tzivuyim, kod makriyo. Whenever the Torah says he spoke or he said, it was predicated on he called him. Loshen chiba. It's an expression of love. Vayikra. Loshen shemalchei ashoris mishtamshim bo. It's an expression which the angels utilize this expression. Shenema v'kora zel zeh. Aval nevi'ei umos ha'olam. However, regarding the prophets of the nations, Niglo Alei Beloshin Aroi Vituma, he reveals himself, his relationship to them is with an expression of happenstance, like randomness, and something which touches upon impurity. Shenema v'yikor Elokim el Bilam. Although Bilam was the prophet of the nations, when Hashem appeared to him, it was v'yikor. Ikar means it's mikra. Mikra means, in reality, he's not worthy. It's only they happen to meet. He happened to meet. Let me explain it. Two people in a room, and before they begin speaking, what does one normally do? One introduces himself to the other person. And after we introduce ourselves to one another, we begin speaking, especially if it's something of great importance. But let's say you're sitting with someone, and without any warning, all of a sudden, you begin the conversation without alerting him that you're about to start speaking to him. To a degree, it's a certain lack of consideration to that person in terms of valuing the person. You first call the person to get his attention, to get his focus, and then you communicate with him. So Vayikra is an expression of chiba because it shows us that you value that person you're going to speak to. You first called him, and after you called him to get his attention, to get his focus, then you begin speaking and communicating, whether it's Vayedaber, which is more formal, or Abira, which is less formal. But it's an introduction to whatever is going to follow. Vayikar is Mikra. Now it's interesting. Bilam, in terms of himself, he wasn't worthy of Nevuah, wasn't worthy of prophecy. Why was he the prophet of the nations? So we had spoken about it over there in Pashas Bolok, that Bilam was not a prophet who was the equivalent of Moshe within a certain context, the nations of the world will say to Hashem, you know why the Jews are so special? Because they have a person representing them who has open communication with you. If we would have such a person, we'd be a different kind of people. So therefore, our level of culpability and liability should not be at that level, because we have a chance. The Jews had a chance because they had Moshe. You never gave us a person. So in terms of Bilam in his own right, was not qualified. As we read who he was pompous, he was egocentric, he committed bestiality, he was almost the personification of evil. But nevertheless, Hashem allowed him to be in this capacity for the sake of the nations. So it was only Vayikra, it was only coincidental. It's a coincidental. He has no relevance to the position. However, Moshe Rabbeinu, Vayikra, he is the person who's qualified for this, and as a result of that, he's called to alert him that something will be communicated, whether in a formal context or an informal context. We find that when Moshe Rabbeinu was returning to Mitzrayim, and he stopped off at an inn on the way from Midian to Egypt, he had a son who he hadn't circumcised, and because he hesitated, the Torah tells us, a snake comes and literally swallows him up from his head to his waist and from his feet to his waist, to indicate that the reason why his life's in jeopardy because he delayed circumcising his child, Moshe Rabbeinu. Tzipporah goes and she realizes what it's all about. She takes a stone and she circumcises her son. And she takes the foreskin, throws it before the serpent, and she says that if not for this, my husband would have died. So it's interesting. And it says in Chazal explicitly that Moshe Rabbeinu was the only one qualified to take the Jews out of Egypt. Nobody else was qualified. And if he would have died at this moment, would have been killed, there wouldn't have been a redemption. And why was he nearly killed? Because he hesitated and he delayed circumcising his child, which he should have. So we had asked Moshe Rabbeinu, if he is the only one qualified, even if he falls short, it's not that he's not going to circumcise his child. It's because his priority was off. He delayed. He first wanted to unload his pack animal, and then he attended to it. That failing was the basis that his life was in jeopardy, that he would have died if his wife wouldn't have interceded at that moment to circumcise that child. How do we understand it? Moshe Rabbeinu. Hashem could pardon him on that one. And only Moshe was qualified. Why wasn't anybody else qualified? Why wasn't Aaron qualified? Only Moshe was qualified. We had mentioned last week, how we find there's a correlation between creation and the Mishkan. Every aspect of the Mishkan. And then we find that after the Mishkan was built, the Torah tells us, Vayivorach Moshe. He blessed them. And who does Moshe correspond to? Because Moshe corresponds to Hashem himself, that just as Hashem, when creation was completed, it says, Vayivorech Vayikadesh, he blessed existence and he sanctified it. Moshe Rabbeinu, being in the place of Hashem, he blessed the handiwork of the Mishkan, which was the equivalent of the conclusion of creation. Right? We spoke about this last week. To be able to be considered the equivalent of Hashem, at what level do you have to be? That means you can't have any aspect of yourself, because you have to be the full receptacle that nothing exists within your being other than God himself. Moshe Rabbeinu's level of prophecy was only at that level because Moshe was Nachnu Mo. He was nothing. There was no trace of himself. He was fully negated to Hashem. And that's why he was Onav Mikol Adam. He was the most humble person to ever walk the face of the earth. He was greater than Avram and greater than David HaMelech. In regard to this, if there is only you, what are you? Your existence is only purely as a pass-through, as an intermediary, only pass through the word of Hashem. You're the receptacle for that. As the Mishkan was the receptacle for Hashem's presence, was the domicile, identically, Moshe Rabbeinu was the domicile and the pass-through for the word of Hashem to come to Klal Yisrael. As a result of that, Moshe Rabbeinu was Vayikra, Loshen Chiba. He called him because he has relevance to that level of relationship. But now we understand why. To receive the Torah at Sinai, you had to be that pass-through. As it says in Chazal, Shechina medaberes b'to grono. When the Shechina spoke to Klal Yisrael, it actually spoke, the words mean he spoke through his throat. He was like the megaphone. Moshe Rabbeinu was the megaphone for Hashem. That means he was the megaphone. He has no identity unto himself. That's the level of the person to be the one who's qualified to receive the Torah at Sinai. So what is the objective of redemption from Egypt? Sinai, to become the Am Hashem. To become God's people, you have to receive the Torah. The person who's going to be qualified to receive the Torah, he has to be the equivalent of that pass-through. If there's any aspect of himself, doesn't qualify. As a result of that, Moshe Rabbeinu, he was the only one who qualified because he was the only one at that level. Therefore, if he would have died, there wouldn't have been a redemption, because the objective of redemption from Egypt was only to receive the Torah at Sinai. Now, why couldn't Hashem pardon him on this one? He hesitated, but he would have been killed. So we explained that the reason why, what activated the bondage in Egypt. Originally, the Jews were esteemed and revered by the Egyptians. When that generation passed away, the Midrash tells us, what did the Jews say? We want to be like the Egyptians, and we're going to stop circumcising themselves. When they stop circumcising themselves, Hashem says, if you want to be like the Egyptians and you no longer want to identify with me, now those who esteemed you and revered you and loved you, they will hate you. And that was the beginning of the bondage. So the Milah failing regarding circumcision, that was the basis for the prosecution against Klal Yisrael. So Moshe Rabbeinu, the only one who's qualified to take the Jews out of Egypt, if he somehow is not 100% in this regarding this mitzvah, automatically he no longer qualifies, because that's the basis for the prosecution. If he himself, the Redeemer, is delinquent at this level, even at his level, to delay that it's not that ultimate priority, therefore he doesn't qualify. But the consequence is going to be, there's not going to be a gula. Doesn't make a difference. Of course, we have to correct the basis for the bondage was because they failed in regard to the milah. That's the understanding. So Vayikra, that Hashem called him wasn't happenstance. It wasn't coincidentally we meet, but rather he addressed him that he wants to communicate something. That's Vayikra, the full word, not Vayikar, which indicates only happenstance. Coincidentally, there's a meeting, which is we find by Bilam.